In March 2019, a passenger aboard the Royal Caribbean ship Allure of the Seas was discovered alive inside a sealed emergency supply container 17 hours after vanishing from a vessel carrying nearly 6,000 people. The discovery defied explanation and raised questions about what happens in the spaces between safety and catastrophe that no one talks about until something goes wrong. Elena Vasquez had booked the Caribbean cruise as a celebration. At 34, she'd finally completed her master's degree in social work while raising 2 children as a single mother. Her sister Maria had insisted on the trip: 7 days of turquoise waters and reggae music, umbrella drinks, and freedom from the relentless demands of graduate school and parenting. Elena had resisted at first, worried about the expense, about leaving her kids with her ex-husband, about taking time that felt unearned. But Maria had worn her down with a particular brand of sisterly insistence that brooked no argument. "You've been taking care of everyone else for 4 years, Percy," Maria had said, waving Elena's protests away. "Let someone take care of you for a week." The Allure of the Seas was a floating city, 16 decks rising like a steel mountain from the water, pools and theaters and restaurants stacked in impossible vertical neighborhoods. Elena felt small walking the corridors, constantly consulting the ship's map to navigate between her cabin on Deck 8 and the dining rooms, the pools, the evening shows that Maria insisted they attend. She'd never been comfortable in large crowds, preferred small gatherings where she could control her environment, anticipate the variables. The cruise ship was the opposite of control. Thousands of strangers moving through identical hallways, announcements echoing from invisible speakers, the subtle but constant motion of the deck beneath her feet reminding her that they were suspended above 3 miles of dark water. But she'd tried to embrace it. For 6 days, she'd followed Maria's lead. Buffet breakfasts that stretched longer than seemed possible, afternoons by the adult-only pool where Maria struck up conversations with couples from Michigan and retired teachers from Florida, evening shows where acrobats defied gravity, while Elena sipped wine that tasted better than it should have given the circumstances. She'd called her children every morning, their faces pixelated on the ship's expensive Wi-Fi. 9-year-old Sophia complaining about her father's cooking while 6-year-old Diego held up drawings he'd made at school. "When are you coming home, Mama?" Diego had asked on the 6th morning, and Elena had felt the familiar tug of guilt mixed with something else: reluctance. She was scheduled to fly back to Phoenix the next day, back to case files and client meetings, and the endless cycle of need that social work demanded. The floating suspension of the cruise, the temporary freedom from responsibility, had surprised her with how much she needed it. "Tomorrow, baby," she'd told him. "Mama will be home tomorrow." The last evening had started like the others. Elena and Maria had dressed for dinner, Elena in a blue sundress that she'd bought specifically for the trip and worn only twice. Maria in the kind of bold print that looked effortless, but Elena knew had required careful consideration. They'd eaten at the specialty steakhouse, splitting a bottle of wine over plates of food that arrived decorated with architectural precision. Maria had been particularly animated, telling stories about her job at the marketing firm, her ongoing frustrations with their mother's refusal to acknowledge that she needed more help with daily tasks, the man she'd been seeing who might or might not be worth introducing to the family. "What about you?" Maria had asked as they walked the promenade deck after dinner. The Caribbean air warm against their skin and music drifting from the various bars and lounges. "When are you going to start living again instead of just surviving?" Elena had laughed, but it came out sharper than she'd intended. "I am living. The kids, the degree, the job, that's all living." "You know what I mean." Maria had stopped walking, turned to face her sister directly. "When's the last time you went on a date? When's the last time you did something just because you wanted to, not because someone needed you to?" The conversation had felt too heavy for the setting, too serious for their last night of vacation. Elena had deflected with humor, suggested another drink, changed the subject to their flights home. But the question had stayed with her as they'd made their way through the ship's evening entertainment. The steel drum band near the pool, the comedy show in the theater, the late-night dancing in the nightclub where Maria had eventually found a partner willing to spin her around the small floor, while Elena watched from a table, nursing a mojito that had gone watery in the tropical heat. Around midnight, Maria had returned to the table, slightly breathless and clearly enjoying herself. "Dance with me," she'd said, reaching for Elena's hand. "I'm tired," Elena had replied. Though that wasn't entirely true, she felt something else, a restlessness that the music and the crowd and the artificial festivity couldn't touch. "I think I'm going to head back to the room." Maria had studied her face in the dim light of the nightclub. "You sure? It's our last night." "I'm sure. Stay, have fun. I'll see you in the morning." Elena had made her way through the ship's corridors past groups of passengers still committed to squeezing every moment from their vacation, past crew members cleaning and preparing for the next day's disembarkation process. The ship felt different at night, larger somehow. The familiar spaces transformed by different lighting and the absence of the daytime crowds. She'd taken a wrong turn somewhere near the elevators, found herself in a section of corridor she didn't recognize, had to backtrack and consult the ship's directory to find her way to Deck 8. But instead of returning to her cabin, she'd found herself drawn to one of the outdoor decks. The night air was cooler than she'd expected, carrying the salt scent of the ocean and something else. The faint smell of fuel and machinery that reminded her they were aboard a massive piece of industrial equipment, not just a floating resort. The deck was mostly empty, just a few other passengers scattered along the railing, looking out at the dark water. Elena had chosen a section of railing away from the others, leaned against the metal barrier, and looked up at the stars. They were brighter here than in Phoenix, away from the city's light pollution, though the ship's own illumination created a dome of artificial brightness that faded into the natural darkness at its edges. She'd tried to identify constellations, remembered her father teaching her to find the Big Dipper when she was Diego's age, but the ship's movement made it difficult to focus on any single point of light. The question Maria had asked kept returning. "When's the last time you did something just because you wanted to?" Elena couldn't answer it, couldn't even identify what she might want apart from the endless list of things that needed to be done. Her life had become a series of responses to other people's needs, her children's schedules, her clients' crises, her professors' assignments. Even this cruise had been something Maria wanted. Maria had planned, Maria had insisted upon. Elena realized she'd become a person who reacted rather than acted, who had trained herself so thoroughly to anticipate and meet other people's requirements that she'd lost track of what her own might be. The thought should have been depressing, but standing there at the ship's railing with the dark ocean stretching endlessly in all directions, Elena felt something else. Not sadness exactly, but a kind of recognition. She'd built a life around being necessary, around being the person others could depend on. It was meaningful work, important work. But it was also work that never ended, never offered the luxury of completion. There would always be another client, another assignment, another need that required her attention. She'd been standing there for perhaps 30 minutes when she noticed she was no longer alone on that section of deck. A man had joined her at the railing, keeping a respectful distance, but close enough that she was aware of his presence. He was older than her, maybe mid-40s, wearing khaki shorts and a polo shirt that suggested he was another passenger rather than crew. He had the slightly pale complexion of someone who worked indoors and the careful movements of someone trying not to appear intrusive. "Beautiful night," he'd said after several minutes of shared silence. Elena had nodded, unsure whether she wanted conversation or solitude, but too polite to ignore him completely. "Very peaceful." "I couldn't sleep," he'd continued, "and too much excitement, I think. My first cruise. I'm still getting used to the motion." They'd talked for perhaps 10 minutes. Nothing significant, the kind of gentle small talk that cruise ships seem to encourage. He'd mentioned being from Ohio, traveling alone, working in insurance. Elena had shared that she was from Arizona, that it was her last night aboard, that she was flying home the next day. Normal conversation, forgettable in its pleasantness. When he'd excused himself, citing an early morning flight, Elena had remained at the railing. The deck had grown quieter as the night deepened, the sounds of the ship's entertainment fading to background noise. She'd checked her phone, nearly 2 a.m. Maria would probably be returning to their cabin soon, wondering where Elena had gone. but Elena had found herself reluctant to return inside. The night air felt good against her skin, and the solitude, real solitude, not the careful privacy she maintained at home, was something she rarely experienced. She'd decided to walk the ship's perimeter to see how it looked from different angles in the darkness. The promenade deck circled the ship's exterior, a walking track that cruise staff promoted for exercise but that took on a different character at night. Elena had the path mostly to herself, her footsteps echoing softly against the deck's surface. The ship's lights created pools of visibility separated by darker stretches where the only illumination came from the stars and the faint glow reflecting off the water below. As she'd walked, Elena had become aware of the ship's sounds. The constant hum of machinery, the whisper of air moving through ventilation systems, the subtle creaks and shifts that reminded her they were aboard something alive in its own mechanical way. These were sounds she hadn't noticed during the day when they were masked by conversations and music and the general activity of 6,000 people sharing the same space. She'd been walking for perhaps 20 minutes when she'd noticed something that stopped her. Near one of the lifeboat stations, she could see that an access gate was slightly open, not wide enough to be obvious, but clearly not properly secured. The lifeboats themselves were massive orange and white structures suspended from davits like giant eggs, each capable of holding more than 100 people. They were scattered around the ship's perimeter, positioned according to international safety regulations that Elena knew nothing about but trusted existed for good reason. The open gate had drawn her attention because everything else about the ship seemed so carefully controlled, so precisely maintained. Even the deck chairs were arranged in perfect rows each evening, reset by crew members who worked while passengers slept. An unsecured gate seemed like the kind of oversight that wouldn't persist on a vessel where safety was paramount. Elena had approached the gate intending to close it properly or perhaps to report it to a crew member if she could find one. But as she'd gotten closer, she'd realized that the gate wasn't simply loose. It appeared to have been deliberately opened, though not completely. Someone had clearly been there recently, had accessed the restricted area around the lifeboats and left without fully securing the entrance. The discovery had activated her social worker instincts, the part of her trained to notice anomalies that might indicate problems requiring intervention. Was someone having thoughts of self-harm? Had teenagers found a place to drink away from supervision? Was this evidence of some safety violation that needed to be reported? She'd hesitated at the threshold, aware that she was considering entering a clearly restricted area, but also concerned about what she might find or fail to find. The responsible thing would be to report the open gate and let ship security investigate. But Elena had also been trained to recognize when immediate action might be necessary, when waiting for proper channels could mean missing an opportunity to help someone in distress. The lifeboat area was darker than the main deck, lit only by emergency lighting that cast long shadows between the suspended vessels. Elena had called out softly, "Hello? Is someone there?" but received no response. The space felt empty, but not definitively so. There were too many shadows, too many places where someone might be sitting unnoticed. She decided to look more carefully, to at least confirm that no one was in immediate danger before returning to report the security issue. The lifeboats were more massive up close than they appeared from a distance, each one a complete vessel capable of independent survival. They hung from mechanical systems that Elena didn't understand but that looked robust and well-maintained, painted in the kind of international orange that would be visible from great distances across water. Each lifeboat had various access points and storage compartments, all secured with latches and locks that appeared designed to be operated quickly in an emergency but also to remain closed under normal circumstances. Elena had run her hands along the nearest vessel's surface, looking for any signs of tampering or disturbance, when she'd noticed that one of the storage compartments showed scratches around its latch, fresh marks in the paint that suggested recent activity. The compartment was roughly the size of a large suitcase designed to hold emergency supplies according to the safety diagram mounted nearby. Water, food, medical supplies, signaling equipment, the kinds of materials that would sustain survivors until rescue arrived. The latch itself was a simple mechanical system apparently designed to be operated without tools, but also to remain securely closed under the various stresses the lifeboat might encounter. Elena had examined the scratch paint more carefully, trying to determine what might have caused the marks. They looked deliberate rather than accidental, as if someone had worked at the latch with something harder than human fingernails. The pattern suggested persistent effort rather than casual investigation. She'd been crouched beside the compartment, running her finger along the damaged paint. When she'd heard footsteps on the main deck, someone was approaching. Probably a crew member making rounds, or another passenger taking a late-night walk. Elena had realized suddenly how her position would appear to anyone who discovered her. A passenger in a restricted area, examining equipment she had no business touching, with no reasonable explanation for her presence. The footsteps had grown closer, accompanied by the soft murmur of voices. At least 2 people, maybe more. Elena had looked around for an exit route but realized she was essentially trapped. The lifeboat area was a dead end, accessible only through the gate she'd entered. To leave, she would have to walk directly past whoever was approaching. Panic had made her stupid. Instead of simply walking out and offering an honest explanation, that she'd noticed the gate was open and had been concerned someone might be in distress. Elena had looked for somewhere to hide until the people passed. The scratched storage compartment had been directly in front of her, its damaged latch suggesting it might not be properly secured. She'd tested the mechanism gently, found that it moved more easily than it should have, opened far enough for her to see inside. The compartment was larger than she'd expected, designed to maximize storage within the available space. It was dark inside, but her phone's flashlight revealed the expected emergency supplies, water containers, sealed food packages, first aid materials, various pieces of equipment she didn't recognize. But there was also space. More room than the supplies required, enough that a person could potentially fit inside if they were willing to be extremely uncomfortable. Elena had looked back toward the approaching voices, estimated their distance, made a decision that seemed reasonable in that moment of mild panic, but would prove catastrophically wrong. She'd climbed into the storage compartment, pulling the lid closed behind her as the voices grew closer. The space was cramped and airless, forcing her into a cramped position with her knees drawn up against her chest. She'd planned to wait just a few minutes until whoever it was had passed, then to exit quietly and return to her cabin with no one aware of her brief trespass. But the lid had closed with a soft but definitive click, and when Elena had tried to push it open again, it hadn't moved. The latch that had opened so easily from the outside had engaged fully when the compartment closed. Elena had pushed harder, trying not to make noise that might draw attention, but the mechanism was clearly designed to secure itself automatically. She was locked inside a space roughly the size of a coffin, surrounded by emergency supplies she couldn't see in the complete darkness, breathing air that already felt thin and recycled. She'd tried her phone immediately, hoping for cellular service that would allow her to call for help, but they were too far from shore for any signal to reach. The ship's Wi-Fi was available throughout most of the vessel, but apparently not inside a sealed metal compartment within a lifeboat. Elena had been completely cut off from communication, trapped in a space that had never been designed for human occupancy. The initial panic had been manageable, uncomfortable, but not overwhelming. Elena had told herself that someone would notice her absence soon. Maria would return to their cabin, find Elena missing, perhaps worry enough to report it to ship security. Or a crew member would notice the damaged latch during routine safety checks and investigate. The compartment's insulation would protect her from the worst of the Caribbean heat, and there was water available if she became seriously dehydrated. But as the minutes had stretched into what felt like hours, Elena's rational optimism had begun to erode. The air inside the compartment grew thicker and more difficult to breathe. The emergency water containers were designed with tamper-proof seals that she couldn't open in the darkness without potentially contaminating their contents. Her phone's battery was dying from searching for signal, its screen providing the only light in the absolute blackness of her confinement. Most disturbing was the realization that her disappearance might not be noticed quickly. Maria had been drinking and dancing when Elena left the nightclub. would likely assume her sister had returned to their cabin and gone to sleep. They had separate beds, separate bathroom routines. Maria might not realize Elena was missing until morning, might even assume she'd gotten up early to pack or to call her children before disembarkation. Ship security would eventually investigate, but Elena had no idea how thorough their search protocols were or whether they included examining the interior of emergency equipment. From the outside, the damaged storage compartment might not appear significantly different from the others. The scratches that had drawn Elena's attention were subtle, visible only upon close examination. As what she estimated to be several hours passed, Elena had tried various methods of attracting attention. She'd knocked on the compartment walls, hoping the sound would carry to the main deck or to crew areas. She'd shouted until her voice grew hoarse, then tried again at intervals she hoped might coincide with someone passing nearby. She'd used her phone to call every emergency number she could remember, hoping one might connect despite the lack of signal. Nothing had worked. The storage compartment was too well insulated to allow much sound to escape, and the lifeboat area was clearly not part of regular foot traffic during nighttime hours. Elena had remained trapped in the cramped darkness while the ship continued its journey toward port, carrying thousands of people who had no idea she was missing. The physical discomfort had become severe as the hours passed. The compartment's dimensions forced Elena to remain in a fetal position that created increasing pain in her joints and muscles. The air grew stale and difficult to breathe, though the space apparently had enough leakage to prevent suffocation. Her body temperature fluctuated between too hot and too cold as the ship's air conditioning and the tropical climate created conflicting thermal environments around her metal prison. But the psychological impact had been worse than the physical. Elena had time to think about her children waking up in Phoenix, expecting their mother to call from the airport, about Maria discovering her disappearance and blaming herself for not returning to check on Elena the night before, about the clients who needed her, the life she'd built through years of careful work, all of it suspended while she remained trapped in a space smaller than a closet. She'd also had time to confront the irony of her situation. Maria's question, when had Elena last done something just because she wanted to, had led directly to this moment. Elena had wanted solitude, had wanted to explore the ship at her own pace, had wanted to understand what seemed like a potential safety issue. Her attempt to act independently, to follow her own curiosity rather than someone else's agenda, had resulted in complete helplessness. The rescue, when it finally came, had felt almost anticlimactic after the extended terror of captivity. Elena had heard voices again, muffled through the metal walls but unmistakably human. She'd pounded against the compartment lid with renewed desperation, shouting until her throat burned, using the last of her phone's battery to activate its flashlight and strobe function in the hope that some trace of light might leak through gaps in the seal. "Help!" she'd screamed, her voice cracking. "I'm trapped! Someone help me!" The voices had stopped. For a terrifying moment, Elena thought she'd imagined them, that her mind had finally begun creating auditory hallucinations to cope with the isolation. Then she'd heard something else, the sound of someone moving through the lifeboat area with purpose, testing latches, calling her name. "Elena? Elena Vasquez? Can you hear me?" The voice belonged to a man with a slight accent she couldn't place. Elena had responded with everything she had left, screaming and banging against the walls of her prison until she heard the blessed sound of someone working at the compartment's latch from the outside. When the lid finally opened, the Caribbean sunlight had been blinding after 17 hours of absolute darkness. Elena had been pulled from the compartment by two crew members wearing the white uniforms of ship security, their faces showing a mixture of relief and bewilderment as they helped her unfold her cramped body onto the deck. The medical examination that followed had been thorough but revealed surprisingly little damage. Dehydration, muscle cramps, some minor cuts on her hands from feeling around in the darkness, but nothing requiring serious medical intervention. The ship's doctor, a efficient woman in her 50s who introduced herself as Dr. Martinez, had seemed more concerned about Elena's psychological state than her physical condition. 17 hours in a confined space can have significant mental health effects. doctor, Martinez had explained as she checked Elena's vital signs in the ship's medical center. Claustrophobia, anxiety, post-traumatic stress responses will want to monitor you carefully. But Elena had felt strangely calm during the examination. The terror and panic of being trapped had given way to something else, not relief exactly, but a kind of clarity she hadn't expected. She'd answered the doctor's questions honestly, described her physical symptoms accurately, but found herself reluctant to discuss the psychological impact of the experience. The investigation had begun immediately. Chief Security Officer Luis Morales, a man in his 40s with the bearing of someone accustomed to managing crises, had interviewed Elena in the medical center while Dr. Martinez continued her examination. His questions had been professional but persistent, clearly designed to determine whether Elena's entrapment had been accidental or deliberate. "You said you noticed the gate was open," Morales had confirmed, consulting notes written in precise handwriting. "And you went to investigate because you were concerned about safety?" "That's right. But you didn't report the open gate to crew immediately. Instead, you entered a restricted area." Elena had tried to explain her reasoning, the social worker instincts that made her reluctant to ignore potential problems, her concern that someone might be in distress, her decision to investigate before involving authorities. But hearing herself describe the sequence of events, she'd recognized how inadequate her explanation sounded. "I realized it was stupid," she'd said finally. "I should have called security right away." Morales had made more notes, his expression neutral but attentive. "The storage compartment you were trapped in showed signs of previous tampering. The latch mechanism had been damaged, probably over several days or weeks. Did you damage it while trying to open it?" "No. The scratches were already there when I found it. That's what made me think someone had been there recently." "And you decided to hide inside because you heard people approaching?" This was the part Elena found most difficult to explain. In the medical center, surrounded by professional staff and normal lighting, her decision to climb into the storage compartment seemed not just stupid, but incomprehensible. She'd tried to describe the momentary panic, the fear of being discovered in a restricted area, the split-second decision that had seemed reasonable in the darkness. "I was scared of getting in trouble," she'd said, aware of how childish it sounded. "I thought I could hide for a minute until whoever it was passed by." Morales had continued taking notes without comment. Elena had wondered what he was writing, whether his report would characterize her as a victim of circumstances or as someone whose own poor judgment had created a dangerous situation. The questioning had continued for over an hour, covering every detail of Elena's movements the previous evening and her experience inside the storage compartment. Morales had been particularly interested in her description of the voices she'd heard, how many people, what they'd been discussing, whether she'd recognized any of them as passengers or crew. "I couldn't make out words," Elena had explained, "just that there were at least 2 people, maybe more. They were talking quietly, but I couldn't tell what about." "Male voices? Female?" "I think male, but I'm not certain." Elena had begun to understand that her entrapment was being investigated as more than just an accident. The damaged latch mechanism, her report of people in the area during unauthorized hours, the fact that the storage compartment had been accessed recently, all of it suggested the possibility of deliberate sabotage or criminal activity. "Are you saying someone might have done this intentionally?" she'd asked. Morales had closed his notebook without answering directly. "We're investigating all possibilities. In the meantime, I need to ask you not to discuss this incident with other passengers. We don't want to create unnecessary alarm." The secrecy surrounding her rescue had become apparent as Elena was escorted back to her cabin. Rather than using the main elevators and corridors, the crew members had taken her through service areas and maintenance passages she hadn't known existed. They'd moved quickly and quietly, clearly trying to avoid contact with passengers who might ask questions about why someone was being helped through the ship's behind-the-scenes areas. Maria had been waiting in their cabin, surrounded by security personnel, and looking like she hadn't slept. When Elena walked in, her sister had burst into tears, not the dramatic crying of someone performing grief, but the quiet, exhausted sobs of someone who'd been holding terror at bay for hours. "I thought you were dead," Maria had whispered as they embraced. "I thought you'd fallen overboard, or I don't know what I thought." Elena had learned that Maria's discovery of her absence had indeed taken several hours. Returning to the cabin around 3 in the morning, Maria had assumed Elena was already asleep and hadn't wanted to wake her by turning on lights or moving around noisily. It wasn't until 7 in the morning, when Elena hadn't responded to Maria's attempts at conversation, that Maria had realized her sister's bed hadn't been slept in. The search that followed had been extensive, but initially focused on the assumption that Elena had either fallen overboard or was somewhere on the ship, possibly injured or unconscious. Security had reviewed footage from cameras throughout the vessel, interviewed passengers who might have seen Elena during the evening, and conducted systematic searches of public areas and restricted zones. "They showed me video of you walking on the promenade deck," Maria had explained, "but then you just disappeared. The cameras lost you somewhere near the lifeboats and no one could figure out where you'd gone." Elena had learned that her rescue had come about almost by accident. A maintenance crew performing routine safety checks on the lifeboats had noticed that one of the storage compartments showed signs of recent disturbance. When they'd opened it to inspect the contents, they'd found Elena inside, barely conscious and severely dehydrated. "The crew member who opened it thought he was going to find a dead body," Maria had said. "He told security he'd never heard sounds like the ones you were making." Elena didn't remember making sounds. Her last clear memory from inside the compartment was using her phone's strobe light in a final attempt to attract attention. Everything after that was fragmentary, voices, the sensation of being pulled from confinement, the overwhelming brightness of daylight. The ship had docked in Miami as scheduled, but Elena's disembarkation had been carefully managed to avoid media attention. She'd been escorted off the vessel through a service entrance, accompanied by security personnel who'd made it clear that discretion was expected from both her and Maria. "The cruise line is handling this as a private matter," Morales had explained during their final meeting. "We're grateful that you're safe, and we want to ensure that your privacy is protected." Elena had understood the unspoken message. Royal Caribbean wanted to avoid publicity that might suggest their safety protocols were inadequate, or that passengers could access restricted areas without detection. In exchange for her discretion, they were prepared to be generous. Medical expenses covered, future cruise credits, a settlement that would compensate her for the traumatic experience. But Elena had found herself strangely reluctant to accept the cruise line's narrative of her experience. During the flight back to Phoenix, she'd had time to think about the damaged latch mechanism, the voices she'd heard in the lifeboat area, the fact that someone had been accessing that storage compartment before her arrival. She'd also thought about the timeline of her rescue. If the maintenance crew had been performing routine safety checks, why had it taken 17 hours for them to examine the lifeboats? Why hadn't the damaged latch been noticed and repaired during previous inspections? And why had her disappearance been kept secret from other passengers even after she'd been found safe? The questions had multiplied during the weeks that followed her return home. Elena had resumed her normal routine, reuniting with her children, returning to work, completing the final requirements for her master's degree. But the experience of being trapped had changed something fundamental about how she understood safety and control. Her children had noticed the change first. Sophia, with the perceptiveness of a 9-year-old, had asked why her mother seemed different after the vacation that was supposed to make her feel better. "You're more quiet," Sophia had observed during one of their bedtime conversations, "like you're thinking about something sad." Elena had tried to explain that she wasn't sad exactly, but that sometimes experiences changed how people saw the world. She'd told Sophia a simplified version of what had happened, that she'd gotten lost on the ship and been scared, but that everything had turned out fine. "Were you brave?" Diego had asked when he'd overheard the conversation. Elena had considered the question seriously. Had she been brave? She'd panicked, made poor decisions, and spent 17 hours in a state of near constant terror. But she'd also survived, had found ways to manage her fear and maintain hope even when rescue seemed impossible. "I don't think I was brave," she'd told her son. "But I think maybe brave isn't about not being scared. Maybe it's about what you do when you are scared." At work, Elena had found herself approaching client cases differently. Her experience of helplessness, of being trapped in circumstances beyond her control, had given her new insight into the people she was trying to help. The domestic violence victims who couldn't leave dangerous situations, The elderly clients who'd lost their independence, the children in foster care who had no control over their living circumstances. Elena felt she understood their experiences in a way she hadn't before. "You seem more present," her supervisor had commented during a performance review. "More connected to the work. It's good to see." Elena had accepted the praise without explaining its source. The cruise line's request for discretion had been reinforced by a confidentiality agreement that prevented her from discussing the incident publicly. But beyond the legal constraints, Elena had found herself reluctant to share the story. It felt too complicated, too strange, too laden with questions that had no clear answers. She'd tried once to research similar incidents, searching online for reports of passengers found in unauthorized locations aboard cruise ships. But her searches had yielded nothing. Either such events were extremely rare, or they were handled with the same discretion that had surrounded her own experience. The settlement money had been substantial enough to pay off her student loans and create a college fund for her children. Elena had accepted it not because she felt it adequately compensated her for what she'd endured, but because it represented a form of closure that allowed her to move forward without ongoing legal complications. But closure proved more elusive than she'd expected. 3 months after returning from the cruise, Elena had still been having dreams about confined spaces, waking in her own bed with the sensation that she couldn't breathe. Dr. Martinez had been right about the potential for post-traumatic stress responses. Elena had started seeing a therapist, paying for sessions with money from the cruise line settlement. "Trauma doesn't always manifest as dramatic symptoms, Doctor," Sarah Chen had explained during one of their sessions. "Sometimes it shows up as hypervigilance, as a changed relationship with risk and safety. You experienced a profound loss of control in a situation where you thought you were being careful and responsible." The therapy had helped Elena understand that her experience aboard the ship was part of a larger pattern in her life. She'd built her identity around being the person who anticipated problems, who took care of others, who maintained control through careful planning and responsible behavior. Being trapped in the storage compartment had shattered that illusion of control in a way that went beyond the immediate physical danger. "What did you learn about yourself during those 17 hours?" Dr. Chen had asked. Elena had thought about the question for weeks before she could answer it honestly. What she'd learned was that all her careful preparations and responsible choices couldn't protect her from the randomness of the world. But she'd also learned that she was stronger than she'd realized, more capable of surviving uncertainty and fear than she'd ever needed to test. "I learned that I don't have to have everything figured out," Elena had finally said. "I can make decisions without knowing all the outcomes. I can take risks without having a complete safety plan." The insight had led to changes that surprised her family. Elena had started dating again, accepting invitations from a colleague who'd been asking her out for months. She'd taken her children on weekend trips that weren't meticulously planned, allowing them to discover destinations and activities spontaneously. She'd even booked another vacation, not a cruise, but a week at a mountain cabin where they could hike and explore at their own pace. "You seem happier," Maria had observed during one of their regular phone calls. "More like yourself, but also, I don't know, more confident maybe?" Elena had recognized the truth in her sister's assessment. The experience of being trapped had been terrifying and traumatic, but it had also forced her to confront fears that had been limiting her choices for years. She'd survived complete helplessness and discovered that survival was possible even when control was impossible. A year after the cruise, Elena had received an unexpected phone call from Luis Morales, the security officer who'd investigated her case. He'd retired from Royal Caribbean and was working as a private consultant, no longer bound by corporate policies about confidentiality. "I wanted you to know that your incident led to some important changes," he'd said. "New safety protocols, improved latch mechanisms on emergency storage compartments, additional security patrols in restricted areas." Elena had appreciated knowing that her experience had contributed to improvements that might prevent similar incidents. But she'd also been curious about questions that had never been fully answered. "Did you ever figure out who was tampering with that storage compartment?" she'd asked. Morales had paused before responding. "We had our suspicions, but nothing we could prove. Probably crew members using the space for smuggling, drugs maybe, or stolen goods, small-scale operation, low-level stuff. When your incident brought attention to the area, whoever it was stopped. The explanation made sense but also felt incomplete. Elena had never been entirely convinced that her entrapment was purely accidental. The damaged latch, the voices in the restricted area, the careful secrecy surrounding her rescue, all of it suggested complications that went beyond simple mechanical failure. But she'd also come to understand that some questions didn't need definitive answers. What mattered was how she'd responded to the experience, how it had changed her understanding of risk and resilience, how it had ultimately led her toward a fuller way of living. Elena's children were now 11 and 8, old enough to understand more complex versions of the story she'd told them about getting lost on the ship. They'd started asking more sophisticated questions about fear and bravery, about how people make decisions when they don't have complete information. "Would you go on another cruise?" Sophia had asked recently. Elena had considered the question seriously. The idea still made her somewhat anxious, but it was an anxiety she recognized as manageable rather than paralyzing. "Maybe," she'd said. "But if I did, I think I'd make different choices. I wouldn't try to handle everything by myself. I'd ask for help sooner." It was a lesson that extended far beyond cruise ship safety. Elena had built a life around independence and self-sufficiency, around being the person others could rely on but who didn't need to rely on anyone else. Her experience of being trapped had taught her that such independence was partially illusory, that everyone eventually needed help, needed rescue, needed other people to notice their absence and care enough to search for them. The knowledge had made her more willing to be vulnerable, more open to the kind of interdependence that healthy relationships required. She'd learned to ask for support from friends and family, to accept help when it was offered, to acknowledge that needing others wasn't a sign of weakness, but of wisdom. 3 years after the cruise, Elena had completed her master's degree and been promoted to a supervisory position in her social work agency. She'd started speaking at professional conferences about trauma recovery and resilience, sharing insights drawn from both her clinical training and her personal experience. She never mentioned the specific details of the cruise ship incident, but she drew on the psychological lessons she'd learned during those 17 hours of confinement. "Trauma teaches us about our capacity for survival," she would tell audiences of social workers and mental health professionals. "But recovery teaches us about our capacity for growth. The goal isn't to return to who we were before difficult experiences, it's to integrate what we've learned into who we're becoming." Elena's speaking engagements had led to consulting opportunities and eventually to a book contract. She was writing about post-traumatic growth, about the ways that surviving difficult experiences could lead to deeper self-knowledge and more authentic living. The work felt like a natural extension of everything she'd learned, both professionally and personally, about the complex relationship between vulnerability and strength. The book's working title was Found Lessons from Unexpected Places, and Elena had struggled with whether to include her own story as more than just background context. The confidentiality agreement with Royal Caribbean had expired, and she was legally free to discuss the incident publicly, but she'd found herself uncertain about whether sharing the story would serve her readers or simply satisfy curiosity about an unusual event. "What would you want people to understand about what happened to you, Gerer?" her editor had asked during one of their meetings. Elena had thought about the question for weeks. What did she want people to understand? That cruise ships weren't perfectly safe? That people could find themselves in dangerous situations through no fault of their own? That survival was possible even in circumstances that seemed hopeless? All of those things were true, but they weren't the most important truth. The most important truth was that the experience of being completely helpless had ultimately made her feel more powerful, not less. She'd discovered reserves of strength and resilience she hadn't known she possessed. She'd learned that she could survive uncertainty and fear and emerge with deeper self-knowledge and greater capacity for authentic living. "I want them to understand that we're all stronger than we think we are," Elena had finally told her editor. "And that sometimes we have to lose control completely before we can learn how to live freely." The cruise ship incident had become a defining moment in Elena's life, but not in the way she might have expected. It wasn't the trauma that defined her, it was what she'd built from the fragments of that experience. The 17 hours of confinement had taught her about the difference between safety and freedom, between controlling outcomes and making authentic choices. Elena still thought about those hours sometimes, especially during moments when she felt overwhelmed by life's demands and uncertainties. But the memory no longer carried only fear and claustrophobia. It also carried the knowledge that she'd survived complete helplessness and discovered that survival was just the beginning of what was possible. She'd learned that the space between safety and catastrophe, the territory she'd been exploring that night on the cruise ship, wasn't empty. It was full of possibilities that couldn't be accessed through careful planning and risk management. Sometimes, she'd come to understand, the most important discoveries happened not when people were seeking adventure, but when they were simply seeking truth about who they might become when everything familiar fell away. The question Maria had asked, when had Elena last done something just because she wanted to, had never been fully answered. But Elena had learned to live the question differently, to make choices based on authentic desire rather than obligation, to risk uncertainty in service of growth rather than security. The woman who'd been trapped in a storage compartment for 17 hours had emerged not just physically intact but spiritually transformed. And that transformation, Elena had discovered, was worth more than all the careful safety she'd spent years constructing around her previous life.